To grab somebody, you need to give a black and white statement with little nuance. So it could be the 5 foods you must avoid, or the 5 things you must do to get your kid into Harvard. And even if these things are extremely situation specific, it worked for some people but not others, that nuance is not going to be something which is as arresting. So we reduce the complexity of bringing up a child or getting a job or developing a habit or training for a marathon into something which is really blunt and very simplistic.
That's Professor Alex Edmans. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Stay tuned to learn why you're probably less open-minded than you think, and why challenging your assumptions helps you break out of those shoulds that get in the way of living a self-directed life. Don't forget to hit that follow button to get new episodes of our show every week. And if you're a regular listener, thank you, and I have a favor to ask. Consider leaving us a review so we can keep bringing you more of the conversations that you love. If you don't know how, here is how to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Go to the Everyday Better page, scroll down to ratings and reviews, and click the number of stars that you want to give us. Then right below that, click Write a Review and add your note. On Spotify, go to our page, click the 3 dots next to the settings wheel and select Rate Show, and then leave us a comment on the episode you liked. As always, thank you for your support and your feedback. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development show where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and to the world around us. A few months back, I got stuck on a question. Every time I would sit down to prep for an interview, I found myself asking, how does our team and honestly our guest really know that the statement they're making or the research they're sharing is true? Now, for a long time, I've tried to live my life by the data. When I'm trying to make a change, I want to use the most effective tools possible. And it's why I started this show. I wanted to know what actually works from people who've lived it or studied it, so we can all make smarter, more intentional choices. But I've also realized that living this way is more complicated than it seems. Everywhere we look, from headlines to social media to self-improvement books, it kind of seems like we're bombarded with claims that are quote-unquote backed by research. Every single day, we are all confronted with more information than we could ever verify. So I started asking my guests how they really knew that what they were sharing was true. You might think that's bold, but it felt necessary. You didn't hear me ask these questions because almost always my producers edited the question from the episode because the answers were, well, honestly, a little bit dry and incredibly technical. They were based on research methodologies and academic caveats. But I eventually realized that I was asking a much bigger question. How do we ever know that we're right? And what do we do if we find out that we're wrong? My guest today is Alex Edmans. He's a professor of finance at London Business School. And Alex started asking his own version of this question years ago after testifying before UK's Parliament on corporate governance. While he was waiting for his turn to speak, Alex heard another expert share a stat that piqued his interest. It basically supported some previous research he'd done separately on pay discrepancies. So he wanted it to be true. But when Alex looked into the study the stat came from, he found it said the exact opposite. The stat the expert had cited had come from an outdated draft. So Alex flagged the mistake, but the committee still included the incorrect information in its final report. Why? Because it fit the story they wanted to tell. In Alex's book, May Contain Lies, How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It, Alex unpacks why even the world's smartest people fall into the trap of misinformation. Today, Alex is here to break down the most common mental biases we have and share the steps we can take to confront them, learning how to be wrong and how to use critical thinking to work through complexities in a world that tries so hard to avoid nuance. Here's Alex.
My day job is as a finance professor, so my job is to produce research. But unusually for a professor, I really like to share the insights with the outside world. So I like to talk with executives, investors, policymakers, the media. And what I realize is how people would latch onto studies depended on whether they liked the findings, not whether it was actually accurate. So if something gave a result that sounded good, it was the world's best study and they lapped it up uncritically. And in contrast, if it was an inconvenient truth, then they would try to dismiss it as purely academic. So why I wanted to write the book is to highlight how our biases can cause us to misinterpret information. What we're looking at is its appeal, not its accuracy.
Yeah. Which is so common. And I don't think most of us realize that we have biases. I think so many of us are moving around the world, seeing information going, of course, this is true. I'm like, this is why the algorithm can be so powerful, right? Because once you get in one echo chamber, you just continue to get the same information over and over again until you believe it to be truth. What do you make of the impact of having so much access to so much information, whether it be entirely true or partially?
I think more information can actually lead to you becoming less informed. So that seems a paradox. How can more become less? Because it means that there's so much information out there that you can always find something to support almost anything you want to support. So if I want to have an excuse to drink lots of red wine after our conversation, I won't need it after the conversation, but if I wanted to, I could find a study, I'm sure, which shows that red wine leads to longer life. And there's so many studies out there, probably somebody has done that research. And if I was a teetotaler and I wanted to stop my friends drinking, I could find a study showing that red wine leads to shorter life. So in the past, we knew what the sources of information were. To get medical advice, you went to a doctor. So that was a trained expert. If you wanted to look up something factual, you'd go down to the library and you'd read an encyclopedia, and only certain people were qualified to write into the encyclopedia. But nowadays, anybody can be an expert. Anybody can post something on social media. And if it seems something which is appealing and attractive, that can go viral, even if it's not based on information.
So what you're really highlighting here is confirmation bias, right? Like our willingness to accept something if it lines up with what we already believe to be true. As we're talking about misinformation, what role then does confirmation bias play?
We don't fall for misinformation because we're bad people. We're just people. And as people, we have a viewpoint. And if we see something that latches onto that viewpoint, then we're more likely to believe it. So you don't want to stop and see, well, is the scientific methodology correct? Is this correlation or causation? And this is why supposedly very smart people, executives, investors, even myself, I admit in many cases in the book, there were cases where I fell for misinformation, even though I'm a supposed professor of finance who understands statistics. So then what would the solution be? I think number one, just like any bias or any even addiction, is just to recognize we have this problem. So if there is something that we like the sounds of, let's just take a step back and be as critical and as discerning as we would be if it gave you the opposite result. So let's give an example of this. A lot of my work is on sustainability, on how if companies are good for society, then it will lead to better outcomes for the company. So if I saw a study which claimed that sustainability pays off, I would love to start tweeting it and sharing it and putting it on LinkedIn and sharing it with all my followers. If I imagine the opposite, let's say the study had found that sustainability led to worse performance, what would I do? I would try and attack it. I'd say, well, maybe the study was only for a few companies for a few years, or maybe the measure of sustainability was dodgy. So now that I've highlighted potential flaws, ask myself, do those flaws still apply, even though the study is in the direction that I want? So one thing you can do is to be your own devil's advocate. But the second is to have cognitive diversity. Now, diversity is obviously something we believe to be important, but it's often reduced to demographic diversity, which is certainly an important starting point, but that sometimes reduces the totality and the complexity of a person to just their gender and ethnicity. Those things do lead to different lived experiences and they do lead to different opinions, but there may be other things which can lead to that. You could be a white male who grew up in a different country because your parents were expats. And so the whole idea of cognitive diversity, if there's other people with different beliefs than you, then they might be discerning about something that you might be willing to accept.
Yeah. I mean, listening to you say that, it's so clear why that diversity is important, but seeking that out is a lot harder than it sounds.
Yeah, it is very difficult, and I think it's something that we would not do unless we're absolutely intentional about it. So one example was in the Brexit referendum in 2016. This is when the UK was voting whether to leave the European Union. And I was a strong Remainer. I wanted the UK to remain, and all of my friends did as well, and all the bubble that I lived in and I worked in were all Remainers. And then one day I went to a talk by a Brexiter. Now, I would love to tell you, Leah, that I did this because I'm really open-minded and I deliberately wanted to hear the other side, but I would be spreading misinformation. That wasn't the case. It was a college reunion, and they had an alumni event where they had this speaker. And I thought, okay, this speaker was speaking on Brexit. He must be a Remainer like me because he went to the same college as me. And he was discussing, no, actually, we should leave the European Union. And to date, this is still the most eye-opening talk that I've heard. I didn't end up agreeing with all of his points, but I could at least see that they were logically argued. And so when the vote was for Brexit, many Remainers were saying, oh, let's have a revote, let's sort of overturn the result. I was more willing to accept it as a democratic outcome, even though I didn't vote in that way, because I had seen there was another side to this.
Yeah, right. And so if we're not willing to listen and we already are showing up with our own bias that something is not going to be logical, then we're very unlikely to take in that information. There's a term that we use when I used to do work in organizational development and psychology called truth spotting, where, you know, you're not looking for why this is 100% wrong, but you're looking for how this might be 1% right. And it does shift you if you're willing to do it, because even though you may not fully agree, you can look at it with a perspective that says, okay, I could be open to potentially understanding how someone may see something different than I do. And I think, I mean, personally, I think we are missing that in a lot of ways in our world today. I want to move a little bit to an example you shared in the book about the Atkins diet and black and white thinking. Can you talk a little bit about how that leads us astray?
Absolutely. So why do I even get into black and white thinking to begin with, and what is it? So before, I've talked about confirmation bias. So that's the idea that we have a strong viewpoint, we latch onto stuff that agrees with that viewpoint. But you might think, well, confirmation only applies to topics about which we have a pre-existing view. You might say, for many things, I don't have a pre-existing view. I'm really open-minded. But the danger of black and white thinking is that even if you don't have a pre-existing view, you are likely to think that something is either always good or always bad. We view the world in binary terms. And so this was why the Atkins diet became so popular. So the Atkins diet was about carbohydrates. Now, there's other main macros. There's fat. Most people believe fat is bad. It's called it because it makes you fat. Protein is good. It builds muscle. But carbs, most people might be quite agnostic about carbs. We don't know whether it's good or bad. So the Atkins diet exploited black and white thinking by painting it as almost always bad. It says, eat as few carbs as possible. And note, carbs, not just simple carbs, and complex carbs are okay. It just put all carbs within the same bucket. That was one example of black and white and binary thinking. The other example is, rather than saying, well, carbs are fine as long as they are 30 to 50% of your daily calories, it said, no, just have as few carbs as possible. That was black and white by saying any amount of carbs is to be avoided. So this played into our biases of seeing things as always good and always bad. And it was easy to implement. So I can decide whether to eat something by looking at the carb label on the nutrition information. I don't need to break down, is this complex or simple carbs? I don't need to tot up, have I reached 30% so far today? I would just avoid it. So to pen a bestseller, Atkins did not need to be right. He just needed to be extreme. And that is what playing into black and white thinking does.
That's so interesting. And it's making me think about what it was like to be pregnant. I mean, I recently gave birth to my first child. And when you're pregnant, it seems like almost immediately you start hearing and learning about the different things that you must do and must not do. And everything feels really black and white. So for example, people immediately say, well, you can't have coffee anymore, any caffeine. It's zero caffeine. You can't have any sushi. at all, 0. You can't have any deli meats at all, 0. And then a friend of mine recommended a book to me called Expecting Better. It's by Emily Oster, and she's an economist. And she looks at all of these different studies and says, well, actually, it's a little bit different than just black and white, 0, like all or nothing. But there is an ease, to your point, in telling people to not do any of it at all, because then no one has to worry about the off chance that you had a little too much caffeine that impacted you or your baby. So it's a really interesting, reading that book has been an eye-opener for me, because I was like, well, I can make the decisions I want to make, but I feel more informed than I felt when at the beginning it was a list of things you must never do.
And I think this is really important. And I think the Expecting Better book is an excellent one, because when you think about what Emily or I are trying to do is try to encourage people to become more discerning about information and data. And you might think we're killjoys. We're saying, oh, well, let's not accept something. Let's always be asking questions. Are we like kind of conspiracy theorists? But we're not. It's the opposite. It allows you to live more freely. Because actually, if you're more discerning, then you realize that a lot of these studies which say you should never do X, they're actually on much shakier ground, so we can live a bit more freely. So while I don't quote from Expecting Better, I do quote from Crib Sheet, which was her follow-up book, because this was something that happened to my wife and me. So when we were expecting our first son, we took a parenting course, and this told us you should exclusively breastfeed your kid. So black and white, no formula, no water, no other fluids, only breast milk for the first 6 months. And so we thought, well, let's do this. This is what the World Health Organization recommends. But then, even though breastfeeding was working, breast milk just wasn't enough for our son. He was still hungry. And you thought, well, should we feed this hungry baby? But not if the World Health Organization says don't give anything else. But when I looked into the data much more carefully, what I found was it was a correlation, not a causation. So what do I mean by this? So studies show that breastfed kids do better than bottle-fed kids along a range of dimensions. It could be physical outcomes, it could be IQ. And so people have claimed it was breast milk that caused these better outcomes. So if you feed anything other than breast milk, you're going to cause some worsening of health. But in fact, it was a correlation, not a causation. There was a third factor driving both. Breastfeeding is tough. It's difficult to do without family support. So it was the mothers who had a more supportive home environment that breastfeed, and it was this more supportive home environment that also led to the better physical and mental outcomes. And I think the message that you are a bad mother if you are not exclusively breastfeeding your baby is very damaging. It can lead to really exhausted mothers. Their partners might be willing to help out and bottle feed, and the mother thinks that I cannot do this because the evidence suggests I'm going to be harming my child. There will be many mothers who either cannot or choose to bottle feed, and we should be empowering those mothers as well, not guilt-tripping them.
Yes, this extra layer of kind of shame and the thing that you're doing wrong with your baby is so unnecessary. There are so many things tied into the context of how much freedom you have, how much support you have, the type of privilege that you have, the type of time that you have. I think we have to talk more about the context of things, particularly when we talk about how often we use social media to compare ourselves with other people who are doing things that we go, oh, I'm supposed to be doing that, right?
So social media wants to grab you, and to grab somebody, you need to give a black and white statement with little nuance. So it wants to seem like these are the things that you must do, and therefore you're going to drop your coffee cup and read this article. So it could be the 5 foods you must avoid, or the 5 things you must do to get your kid into Harvard. And even if these things are extremely situation specific, it worked for some people but not others, that nuance is not going to be something which is as arresting. So we reduce the complexity of bringing up a child or getting a job or developing a habit or losing weight or training for a marathon into something which is really blunt and very simplistic.
Right. As I was thinking about this with my team and we were talking about misinformation or partial information, one of the things that came up for me is, in my field, there are lots of scientific references, but there are also lots of like kind of half scientific references to strategies or tactics or tips that can work when it comes to building habits, reaching your potential, accomplishing a goal. They may not all be fully backed and, peer reviewed when it comes to the strategy, tactic, or the approach, but sometimes they help. And so I wonder what your perspective is on, things that may not be perfectly informed, but are still a value add for people.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because we don't want to be pedantic and let perfect be the enemy of the good, because it shouldn't be that unless something is peer-reviewed in the top flight medical journal, we should completely dismiss it. There are certain things where the science might be emerging and there could be some suggestive evidence that something works that hasn't been definitively proven beyond reasonable doubt, and we want to learn from that. And I would just say just to perhaps follow that advice, but recognize that it is not absolutely perfect, so we don't want to follow it necessarily religiously. So let's say if there was a new study just coming up with something claiming that waking up at 6 a.m. every day is better for you in the long term, maybe you would start following this and maybe you will try to go to bed earlier, to wake up earlier. But there might be some times where you're just exhausted. And if you realize, well, this is suggestive evidence backed by some suggestive data, then I can actually sleep in a couple of days and not feel guilty if I think just that my body will need this extra rest. So I think what data should lead to us is that data should not tell us how to live, but data should inform us about the trade-offs and the consequences of our actions. So if the data shows that maybe 5 units of alcohol per week is less good for your health than 0, but the health consequences are small, I might still be willing to have 5 units of alcohol per week. Mm-hmm. Somebody else could look at the same thing and say, my only goal is health, and choose to be completely teetotal. And also, the problem with these studies is these studies only look at one objective. So is breast milk or bottle feeding better to improve your IQ? What is the best way to lose weight? But we don't just have one objective in life. And for other people to tell us how to live, I think that assumes that their goal is the same as ours. Mm-hmm. And instead, what I want is the information about the trade-offs and the consequences of my actions. And then for me, given the different objectives that I have for my life, this will lead me down the path that I want to do. And then I should not condemn somebody else for making a different decision.
Got it. Which is really powerful. So it's like everything else. It's not a binary thing. It's like there's so many inputs to how you make decisions. Coming up, Alex shares practical tips for how we can confront our biases. He also tells me about how to avoid groupthink, something anyone who works with other people needs to hear. We'll be right back in just a few moments. And we're back with Professor Alex Edmans. If we're thinking about, in like a work setting, we all have, that person who's critical, or the person who is able to say, I'm putting my hat on to sort of challenge what everyone else is talking about, and offer a different viewpoint that may frustrate them. How do we think about managing or creating more cultures where that's okay? And we're avoiding this idea of groupthink, because to be that person who's the challenger can sometimes feel like, gosh, I'm annoying. Like I'm the one in the group who frustrates everybody. And yet we need that. Like how do we get better at fostering these cultures that allow for the challenger or the person who's pushing back on ideas?
I think this is a great question. I think if it's a question that would be solved, then it would just really transform how decisions are made in group settings. So what might help this? I think number one is just to set the culture as being something where you encourage different viewpoints. So I started my career at Morgan Stanley in investment banking. I was right at the bottom. I was a junior analyst. And what you're led to believe is that as a junior person, you should just toe the line. You should just do the work that you're told. Don't ask any questions, don't make any suggestions. But in my first review, 6 months in, it said, notably for a first-year analyst, Alex has the courage to express his own views, which is to be encouraged. And this said far more about the organisation than it did about me, because this meant that the organisation was one that did enjoy and appreciate different viewpoints. So I had been led to believe that I should just toe the line and accept everything. But what they told me actually corrected this misperception that I have. And often we have these incorrect perceptions of organisations or people. This boss might be said to be somebody who's very harsh. But in fact, if you were to say, no, I do genuinely appreciate different viewpoints, this is important. Maybe you are in a board meeting and you're the chair of the meeting and somebody expresses a different viewpoint. They say, I don't think we should go ahead. And this is discussed and taken seriously. You still go ahead. Then what do you do as the chair of the meeting? Well, if you were to go to that person and say, I know this must have taken some courage for you to express these viewpoints. I want to know that we really value this. And even though we still went ahead with the decision, we will take into account all your concerns when we execute it. Because if you didn't do that, the person might think I had to spend a lot of political capital expressing my concerns. I probably annoyed some people. I delayed the meeting by half an hour, and it didn't make a difference anyway. So the next time I have concerns, I am going to just keep them to myself.
Right.
But I just gave suggestions for how the organisation can encourage dissent. But I'd also like to offer a suggestion to the dissenter, him or herself, is actually nearly all the time that I've dissented myself, it has been received more positively than I would have feared, as long as it's done in the constructive way. So I was actually in a board meeting yesterday where there was something where many people were quite uneasy about. People were sort of beating around the bush and not really saying it explicitly. And then one board member said, I'm feeling quite uncomfortable here. That then sparked me to raise my concern, which sparked other people. But had she not been brave enough to have come up with that more explicit but constructively expressed concern, then maybe the rest of us might not have followed suit. And so in the end, there was actually no stigma to her from expressing this, because there were other people who also shared the view, but it needed one person to light the first spark, and I'm really grateful that she did.
That takes me back to school, even grade school and university, where you're sitting in the classroom and the teacher says something or the professor says something and everyone's silent. And then they say, oh, does everybody get this? Nobody raises their hand. And then you leave the class and everyone's like, did you get it? And we're like, no. And so, I mean, how many times has that happened? It's like countless times where, then on the other side, seeing someone brave enough to raise their hand and say, actually, this doesn't make sense to me. And most people don't for fear of looking stupid. And then you realize that actually everybody else has the question, or many other people have other questions about things that don't make sense to them. And so that leads to this waterfall of people being more vulnerable and then actually getting the information they need.
I think this is really important, and this is something really incumbent upon me to bear in mind when I teach, being a professor. So what I try to do in my very first class is I say I encourage all questions at any point in time. If you don't understand something, it is probably my fault for not having explained it clearly enough. Now, I'm not always going to get it right. And if I know that I am teaching a particularly difficult topic, I will try to remind the students of what I said right at the start. This is something where I'm even more open to questions, because I know this is something that some of you might be struggling with.
So, Alex, how do we get better at finding the truth? I think you have a few different steps that you talk about, but what are some key things we can do?
I think the first is to recognize our own biases. And by our, I absolutely mean me, myself. And so to realize that we are people, we have biases. So can we take some active steps to try to address them? And the danger of saying something like this or writing it in my book is I have to try and practice what I preach. So when I was writing my book, the agent that I went with was the one who was the most critical about my proposal because I thought he had the potential to improve it the most. Whereas with other agents who said, it's amazing, I'm going to send it up to the publisher right now, that would have been the easiest ride for me.
That would feel good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get it out, and me thinking I'm such a great author, if they think it's right, it must be right, and I don't need to revise it. And this agent was telling me, no, I do need to revise it. And then after writing the first draft, I sent it out to people who I knew I could trust to disagree with me. So I would to recognize your blind spots, to take active steps to try to address those blind spots. I think another step is to just be questioning about what you see. And by questioning, I don't mean being a cynic or being a conspiracy theorist, but just to be discerning. So just like we teach our kids, don't accept sweets from strangers or don't get into a car from somebody you don't know, that is not teaching them to be cynical, but just teaching them to be rationally and reasonably questioning. I think this is something we should apply ourselves. For me, when something's presented to me, I will think about, is this something that I can truly believe? What is the evidence behind it?
You also said something about pausing before we share anything, which I think is interesting. And I have to say, I definitely, as I was starting to get into this work, am guilty of, being someone who learns something, on a show one day or on an episode one day of the conversation with an expert and goes, oh my gosh, I have to tell someone. And my intention typically is I want people to know this thing that I just learned from this expert so that they can apply it, so they can understand it. But I recognize that that's not always the best way to approach things. So I'm curious about, what are the questions we should be asking ourselves before we go out and share in that pause?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, Leah, because why do we share misinformation? It's not because we're bad people. We genuinely want to inform our friends. If now there's this theory that sunscreen is actually bad for your skin, we want to warn other people about it. But just to ask, well, what is the evidence behind it? And there might be sometimes when I've shared something on LinkedIn and then somebody's called me out and they said, well, actually here, this reference that you've done is incorrect. So what I will do is I will edit my original post, but I will still keep the comment and then reply to it and say, oh, you are absolutely right, this was incorrect. Because the other approach would be just to edit it and then delete the comment as if I got it right all along. But by responding to the comment, then that makes people realize that I'm somebody who does like to be challenged. So the next time somebody sees maybe there's an inaccuracy in my post, they don't think, oh, if I respond in the comment, Alex is going to flame me. I have seen people on LinkedIn where if there's a negative comment, then you just get a personal attack against you. I hope that I can bring the opposite message. If somebody spots something wrong, then I'll just thank them for it and just make an amendment.
Well, and that builds a lot of trust in you as an expert, which is kind of it's the non-natural way to think about expertise. We think that if you have expertise, you're never wrong. And so, if you are wrong as the expert, then you feel like, oh my gosh, maybe my credibility is being challenged. Where in reality, it's like, of course you have expertise, but again, we're human, we're imperfect, and things change or we miss things. And so in order to continue to maintain a level of expertise and trust, it's really valuable to be able to say, oops, got that wrong. Let me actually leave this here, which I think is honestly commendable. I know it's just on LinkedIn, but it's like the fact that you're willing to do that shows that you're willing to be wrong in order to get to the truth.
And I think that might be the mark of true expertise, to be sufficiently secure about your knowledge on a topic that you're willing to hear different viewpoints. Whereas why might it be sometimes that you just don't want to read the other view because you deep down know that your own knowledge is fragile, that you're worried that you'll see something that will contradict your viewpoint because your actual viewpoint is based on shakier ground. So I do think it is important for experts to try to read the other side. Again, I could disagree with 90% of what they say, but maybe there's 10% which leads me to be more informed than before I started reading the article or listening to that talk.
And Alex, I mean, I know you're saying that we shouldn't become complete and total skeptics, but what I think you're inviting is a healthy amount of skepticism for people, a healthy amount of critical thinking that perhaps we're not used to doing. That does require a little bit more of our time. But I wonder what you really believe happens when we do use this healthy amount of skepticism, especially in this age of so much information and misinformation.
I think we become more well-rounded individuals. We're willing to see both sides of tricky topics. We realize that things are not black and white. I think for us, this also allows us to live more freely. It may be that you are 7 months pregnant and you can enjoy 1 cup of coffee or a little bit of sushi, and you do this without any guilt. And that can probably lead to better outcomes for your baby because then you're able to be more relaxed as an expecting mother. I also think it encourages other people to then share dissent in different viewpoints, because if you're known as somebody who's balanced and nuanced rather than just extreme and one-sided, I think that empowers other people that you interact with, be this in your organization or be on LinkedIn, to be willing to share different perspectives with you. And I think if we all do that individually, then as a society, can society become less polarized because we'll be more willing to hear the other side. I think this will be really good for wider society.
Oh, completely agree. Okay, I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements for me, Alex, and I'm going to switch them up a little bit. Better informed people are.
More discerning.
Better informed work is.
One that considers different viewpoints, in particular those that you disagree with.
And a better informed world has.
Freedom to express different viewpoints and appreciation for the other side.
Alex, thank you so much. This was incredible. I learned a lot. So thank you for sharing your expertise. And also thank you for being an example of someone who is an expert and also willing to be wrong.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this. We could have gone on for longer and longer, but yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
That was Alex Edmans, a professor of finance and the author of May Contain Lies: How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It. If you like this episode, you'll also love my conversation with medical journalist Trisha Pasricha, where we break down how to approach the latest wellness trends with a little more wisdom and a little less attention to just what's viral. You can find a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Grace Rubin and Emily Reeves. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. Tim Boland mixed our show. We get additional support from Alex Kuznetsova. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Koop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief and vice president of content development at LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and we'll see you next week.